Equals the evening of November 14th, 1940, unfolded beneath a gentle autumn hush. Coventry Cathedral stood serene, its spire catching the last ember of twilight. Thomas Harper, the cathedral verger, polished brass candlesticks in the nave, unaware that this would be the last time he'd see the great church whole. Outside, the market closed early. Fireman Jack Morris shared a cigarette with his crew by the station doors, their laughter echoing off cobblestones. Nurse Margaret Doyle prepared her ward at Gulson Road Hospital, glancing toward the darkening horizon. Over near Whitley Common, gunner Arthur Webb checked his Bofors gun, eyes trained skyward. The wail of the first air raid siren broke the calm like a blade through glass. In that instant, Coventry's heart began to tremble, poised on the edge of the fiery abyss.
At 7:20 p.m., the drone of engines poured over the city like a metallic swarm. The Luftwaffe had launched Operation Moonlight Sonata. Spotlights pierced the night, their beams slicing through smoke and low-lying fog. Arthur yelled to his crew, "Targets overhead, northwest!" A moment later, the bombs began. The first high explosive struck the power station, plunging much of Coventry into darkness. Fireman Jack raced through the streets, sirens screaming past him, windows shattering around the pump truck. In the cathedral, Thomas knelt beneath the organ loft as stained glass erupted in a storm of color and dust. Margaret rushed patients to the shelter below the hospital, murmuring prayers drowned out by detonations above. The sky itself seemed aflame, and every heartbeat was another explosion.
By midnight, Coventry was a furnace. Streets that once smelled of baking bread now reeked of cordite and burning timber. Jack's fire brigade fought in vain to contain the inferno engulfing Broadgate. "Hydrants are dry," one shouted, his voice cracking amid the roar. The cathedral's roof blazed like a torch, timbers collapsing in showers of sparks. Thomas, coughing through smoke, tried to save the communion silver, his eyes stinging as the nave filled with flame. Over the city's edge, Arthur's gun crew fired blindly into the haze, their ammunition running low. "Keep them off us!" he yelled, his face lit by each burst of tracer fire. In hospital corridors thick with soot, Margaret tended the wounded, their bandaged faces ghostly beneath emergency lamps. Above it all, the bombers droned on, indifferent and unending. At 12:22 a.m., a massive explosion tore through the cathedral's east end. Thomas was thrown to the floor, ears ringing, vision blurred. The great wooden beams gave way above him, with a groan that sounded almost human. Crawling through debris, he reached the altar, now buried beneath embers and glass. Nearby, the Dean's Cross still stood, silhouetted in the burning ruin. "Save what you can," Thomas whispered hoarsely to those beside him. Outside, the tower clock had stopped forever. Flames leapt skyward, visible for miles, a beacon of destruction over Warwickshire. The people of Coventry would later say the cathedral burned like the city's soul itself. Yet even then, Thomas refused to flee. Clutching the charred remains of a Bible, the last relic of faith within the inferno.
Near dawn, Margaret and her team transformed the hospital into a field of triage. The wounded arrived endlessly. Burns, fractures, shock. "Keep breathing," she told a young boy, pressing his trembling hand. Outside, ashes drifted like snow. When a portion of the hospital took a hit, they moved patients into the basement, light replaced by flickering candles. In the eerie half-dark, she found quiet courage. Thomas stumbled in carrying an elderly parishioner, their clothes blackened with soot. "Both of you, down here," Margaret insisted, guiding them to safety. Above ground, fires still raged, but in the cellar there was a fragile humanity, a whisper of defiance against chaos. Coventry had become a city of angels, forged not of wings, but of smoke and endurance. Arthur's crew remained at their post long after orders had ceased. The Bofors gun sat blackened from overuse,
its barrels glowing faintly in the frosted air. "Just one more pass," Arthur muttered, scanning the bruised sky. Beneath them, Coventry burned as daylight tried to break through the haze. The men around him were silent, exhausted, hollow-eyed. When the final sortie ended near 6 a.m., he lowered the gun sight, feeling an empty weight settle in his chest. Smoke smeared the horizon like grief itself. A pigeon, dazed and soot-covered, fluttered past. In that fragile silence, Arthur lit his last cigarette and whispered a prayer for the city that had held firm through hellfire. Even in ruin, they had not yielded. The first sunlight revealed a city transformed, an ashen skeleton of its former self. Streets were unrecognizable, landmarks gone. Jack walked slowly through the ruins, helmet dented, hands blistered. Around him, silence hung heavy, broken only by the crackle of collapsing timbers. He found the shell of the cathedral and stood beside Thomas among the smoking stones. "It's gone," Jack whispered. Thomas nodded, holding a fragment of melted brass. "No," he murmured, "not gone. Changed." Elsewhere, Margaret guided survivors to makeshift first aid stations, faces gray but spirits unbroken. Even Arthur, weary from the guns, joined the cleanup, handing out water bottles from a broken hydrant. Coventry had been struck, but its heart still beat beneath the ashes.
Through the day, the survivors became rescuers. Jack and his team pried open collapsed shelters, voices echoing through rubble piles. "Is anyone alive down there?" he called again and again. From beneath a twisted beam, a muffled cry answered. Hours later, they pulled a young mother and baby into the light. Margaret rushed forward, wrapping the child in her coat. The sight brought sudden tears to men who had not flinched under bombs. Arthur arrived, lending his strength to shift debris, while Thomas offered quiet prayers over the fallen. Amid devastation, life still whispered. The courage that night had forged now bound them together, a defiant chorus of survival that would echo across generations.
That evening, a weary peace settled over Coventry. Bells no longer rang, but in the cathedral ruins, Thomas placed 2 charred beams together in the shape of a cross. Around it, soldiers and civilians gathered, heads bowed. Jack lit a lantern that flickered against shattered stone. Margaret distributed bread and tea, her hands trembling but steady. Arthur leaned on a wall, eyes reflecting the glow. They didn't speak much. Words felt too small for what had been lost. Yet in the silence, the people of Coventry found unity. The city was wounded, but its spirit refused to die. From the ruins, a promise was born: to rebuild, to remember, and never to surrender to darkness again.
Weeks later, amid frost and ruin, signs of rebirth began to appear. Children played near the cratered square, their laughter a fragile melody above the wind. Thomas joined Jack, Margaret, and Arthur before the cathedral's skeletal walls. "We'll rebuild," the verger declared, his breath a ghost in the cold air. The others nodded silently. Across Britain, the name Coventry became a synonym for devastation, but also resilience. Factories resumed work. Aid poured in. The ruins of the cathedral remained untouched, a monument to faith endured through fire. And in time, a new cathedral rose, side by side with the old. Coventry's longest night had passed, but its light, born of courage, still burned eternal.